Hello, in this video, I want to continue the series that we've been doing with Baudrillard and space privatization. I think that it's really important to be able to understand how this could be a particular angle in the resolution, not only because I think that Baudrillard has a lot of things to say about the ways in which we particularly think about the evolution of space, science, and technology as it relates to things like symbols and signs and other things, but I also think that this can give a really good insight of what maybe some other postmodern angles for the resolution looks like and why this resolution kind of gets messy in the context of how it comes into contact with things like postmodernism. And in the last video, if you haven't, I would go back and definitely watch it because it kind of starts off the basis for the conversation that we'll be having in this video. And the last one, I start talking about like how we'll be answering Baudrillard affirmatives when they show up on the affirmative and the best ways you can attack that from the perspective of what your base priorities should be, your best case arguments and the ways you should be organizing them, and what your framework and T arguments should be. And in this video, I really want to continue that conversation as we begin to talk about how you can kind of read things like the criticism, counterplans, or disads against these Baudrillard affirmatives. I think that's really important to make sure that you have like a wide range of flexibility for the type of arguments that you can read, because I definitely think that there are different times depending on how they read the affirmative and what type of kind of like arguments or theories they're really spiking is like a place that means that you really need to have like a diverse amount of arguments that you can really go for and they're in your bank. And so I think that there are a lot of really interesting ways that you can kind of talk about that from various perspectives. And so hopefully that video gives you a lot of context for what you'll be doing here. In the context of what we think in terms of like what this does for the criticism, it's really important, I think, in the context of being able to execute a criticism against this type of affirmative by being able to kind of like talk about the various ways in which you can frame the debate in the first place and the value of debating. I feel like so many arguments are made about from the Baudrillard teams about like why the academy is a kind of source of violence and is one that isn't one of transformative change. I feel like that from a lot of other criticisms, there are actually some arguments that could be made that are in the opposite direction. I think making arguments that, for instance, that there is value to debate for marginalized folks, that there is a reason why being able to debate and being able to like, not even if it's not like from the, for instance, being able to learn about the state, but being able to learn about how people are able to survive and navigate daily forms of violence that debaters face outside of the context of debate, or just means something in terms of like the type of study that we take up could be really useful, because I feel like there are a lot of arguments to make about like even if it shouldn't be under the normative academic confines of how debate is kind of institutionally bound, there should be a way for us to think about the ways in which we take up study in ways that are productive, even if it's like kind of in but not of the institutions that we're in. And I think that the ones that we occupy at least. And I think that being able to make arguments about the various values of that can make arguments about why the particular link arguments you're making about what Baudrillard means on a material level outside of the epistemological frame and what the strategies mean for like what we do at something more material could be a really interesting way for you to interrogate and generate link arguments for yourself for criticism and to make things like this a lot more viable for yourself. The other place I think that is really important for this criticism to thrive is being able to have leak arguments that work on a variety of levels that go from the material to the more epistemological and the kind of like top level theory based. I think that obviously like from a lot of structural criticisms, whether it be, you know, things like the CAP-K, settler colonialism, Afro-pessimism, etc., these types of criticisms usually have like really like good generic kind of indices of just Baudrillard's theories as a whole, because of the way that there are like some really obvious holes in Baudrillard's early writing about the way that he's considering the kind of like textualization of things like slavery, settler colonialism, and genocide towards like how we're able to actually think about the way in which these these various violences kind of like show up and like require differential responses from differential communities. And so I think that being able to think about the ways in which you can create a frame for how you want the judge to understand like the way that you kind of like intervene into the question of like these indicts from something that's a little bit more specific, i.e. the way in which their particular methodology is able to show up in the material world, means that you can have like indicts that work at a kind of like top level theory that disagree with maybe the way in which it's talking about how science and civils are organized, where their origin or proximate root cause is, but you're also able to have the impact and the effect of having a really material kind of like scenario for being able to explain why the applicability of what this method will look like in the real world is something that also proves that it's violent and something that kind of produces and invests in the same sources of structures of violence that kind of like make these signs and symbols like basically responsible for various sources of violence in the first place. And I think that there are a lot of ways in which you can kind of like make your criticism then pop by having, I think, an alternative that probably works on the basis of thinking about like how you can kind of like mess with questions of like symbolic value, questions of like signs and simulacra, etc. I don't think this means that you necessarily have an alternative that really like speaks to the same register of Baudrillard, but I think it would be interesting for you to be able to interrogate questions of like communication, representation, and thinking about ways that you can kind of refuse the kind of choice of paradigm that Baudrillard is really giving between one that is like really based on the mimicry of the form of the state and society, and one that is based off of this kind of radical refusal that may be like all too humanist in its understanding. I think that being able to kind of figure out the way I think that the way that the way that you then transition a lot of this advice into things like counterplan and dissent debating, a lot of the advice that I would give in the context of counterplans is really how can you create a model of competition so that the judge kind of understands that regardless of whether or not they're winning, that they have to defend the material ends of their particular plan or their way of like doing methodology, that there is a means of competition for you able to win like the value of various types of politics or the value of being able to debate about policy in the first place, making arguments about like why various types of analytics that are able to kind of like think about like why the public is important for being able to make decisions about space, the kind of like value of being able to think about space because of the way in which it's necessary for us to think about the improvement of various types of sciences, technologies that are valuable to infrastructures that are important to people's like everyday lives, all of which are really important places I think for you to be able to win at the impact scenarios that you're reading, regardless of whether or not there's a material effect to the debate happening, that there's an importance to kind of talking about them and having a more well-informed like citizenship that's able to speak through the ways in which these kind of like forms of competition happen. And I think that having a really big debate on why your impact comparison matters, why there's value to being able to consider human life, whether it be in utilitarianism or not, are all really important arguments for you to make about like why the decisions that we make in debate, even if they can't, for instance, decide whether or not the button is really pushed on all of humanity, are still important for like the future roles that we may serve and the way that we're able to think about like the role that various types of study and like our academic kind of standing place in terms of our ability to understand these issues in the first place and our ability to have meaningful dialogue about them at all. And I think that making arguments about like the kind of the value of debating within your kind of counterplan and dissent arguments makes things like a shit ton easier, and also makes it a lot easier for you to be able to understand how the judge is able to compare the types of impacts that you're reading and understand the way in which you want them to take a particular frame, even if it's not a policymaker, but to understand the value of like how space kind of relates to a question of like what we do as a human race and what that's able to do to change like the terms of like the way in which we use various aspects of space as all kind of important to the way in which the kind of like counterplan and dissent is being evaluated outside the confines of just its particular material impacts. Hopefully this video is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into more stuff that I'll be doing with space and Baudrillard and all types of stuff. And yeah, thank you as always.